My name is Olivia, and I'm 34 years old. I'm married to Robert, and we finally moved into our new home in an upscale suburb. This house seemed like a dream come true, spacious, cozy, with a large garden where I envisioned romantic dinners and summer evenings with a glass of wine in hand. Robert was delighted. The house symbolized success and the beginning of a new chapter in our lives. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. On the second day of our move, while we were still unpacking boxes, a man in an expensive suit and sunglasses appeared at our gate. He was smiling slightly, and I couldn't quite figure out who he was. It turned out to be James, Robert's uncle, someone we hadn't been in contact with for a long time. It was both surprising and a bit strange to discover that he was our new neighbor. James wasn't just a relative. He was known as a controversial businessman with a scandalous reputation. Robert had always mentioned him in passing, never diving into the details of their family ties, and I had assumed they had drifted apart. Robert seemed a bit puzzled by his appearance, but James didn't give any reason for concern. He approached us, extended his hand, and said he was glad to see us in the neighborhood. Robert looked surprised, but they quickly found common ground, reminiscing about old times. I couldn't shake the feeling of awkwardness. I never expected our new neighbor to be the Uncle Robert rarely spoke about, and didn't seem eager to reconnect with. James offered to help with the move, and though I felt a bit uneasy, I accepted his offer. He turned out to be polite and charming, effortlessly keeping the conversation going. Unlike Robert, James was a great listener, catching every word I said. That first evening, he shared so many intriguing stories about his life that I felt like I had known him much longer than I actually had. Robert was busy with his own affairs and didn't pay much attention to our conversation. He seemed content with the fact that his uncle was helping us settle in. But even then, I began to notice that James looked at me differently, not like a regular neighbor. His glances lingered too long, and his smiles were too personal. It was flirtation, and though I tried not to let it affect me, something inside me responded. With each passing day, James started visiting more often, helping us settle in and offering advice on how to arrange our furniture. Robert didn't express any discontent. Maybe he was even pleased that someone from the family was around. And I found myself looking forward to his visits. This attention, those looks, they filled my life with bright emotions that had long vanished from my marriage with Robert. Being with James felt easy and liberating, a welcome escape from the monotony of everyday life. One day, while Robert was at work, James suggested we take a walk around the neighborhood. It was just a simple stroll, but everything felt different. Initially, I didn't think much of it, but soon these walks became a regular thing. We strolled along the quiet streets, shared stories about our lives, and with each time, I realized more and more that James was not just Robert's uncle. He was a man who understood me. His attention felt genuine, making me feel special. We talked about things I couldn't discuss with Robert, my dreams, fears, and disappointments. James was a great listener and gave me the kind of understanding I had been missing. I noticed how his gaze lingered on me longer than appropriate, and there was something in those looks that went beyond mere friendly interest. One evening, as the sun was setting, we stopped by the park and sat on a bench. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, and everything around felt perfect. Too perfect for a simple walk with a neighbor. We talked about our lives, and then James paused, looked at me, and quietly said, "You deserve more than what you have now." My heart skipped a beat. His words hit me like a sudden blow, making me think. He didn't elaborate, but the hint was too clear to ignore. Those words planted a seed of doubt in my heart. James was no longer just Robert's uncle. He became someone who saw the real me, who understood my internal struggles and supported me when I needed it most. His flirtation was subtle but persistent. He knew how to play on my emotions. I realized this wasn't just sympathy. I was drawn to him, and it was much more powerful than a simple attraction. At home, I felt the growing distance between Robert and me. Our conversations became shallow, and intimacy was rare. Robert was busy with work, and our relationship was slowly fading. I couldn't ignore the fact that I missed the attention I got from James. He was like a breath of fresh air, but also a source of inner conflict. I tried to fight these feelings, reminding myself it was wrong. He was my husband's relative, but the pull towards him was stronger. Every night I wrestled with guilt, but each new day brought new meetings and new conversations that felt more important than all the rules. I knew this was leading to something dangerous, but I couldn't stop anymore. It happened one of those evenings when Robert was away on business, and I was home alone. James texted me, saying he was nearby and suggested stopping by for a cup of coffee. I hesitated for just a moment, knowing it wasn't right, but I agreed anyway. Conflicting emotions were battling inside me, but I couldn't resist the temptation. When James stepped into the house, the atmosphere changed immediately. The tension was palpable, and I knew something was about to happen. We sat in the kitchen, talking about trivial things, trying to avoid the obvious, but the spark between us was too blatant to ignore. At some point, the conversation ceased, and silence hung between us. James moved closer, and I felt his hand brush against mine. It was like a flash. Both of us knew we had crossed a line. I don't know what came over me, but the next moment I felt his lips on mine. It was our first kiss, forbidden and so wrong. I realized the immorality of what was happening, but at that moment, nothing else existed. I couldn't stop, even knowing that it was a betrayal, not only of Robert, but of his entire family. After that evening, our meetings became secret. We called each other late at night, exchanged messages that lingered on our phones as indelible traces of our connection. These conversations were not just infidelity. They were something more. Each word was like a knife cutting through my principles and morals. I felt trapped by my own emotions and actions, but couldn't bring myself to end it. The real catastrophe occurred one night when James stayed over while Robert was away. We talked for hours, and as always, it led to the inevitable. For the first time, we were so physically close that all my morals and common sense deserted me. My affair with my husband's uncle became both thrilling and destructive. I knew I was making a mistake, but could no longer step back. Every moment spent with him felt like a forbidden fruit, irresistible despite the consequences. I knew it was tearing me apart inside, but I couldn't fight it. Every kiss, every touch made me forget everything that had held me back from falling. My relationship with James was becoming more intense, and we found new ways to meet discreetly. We chose secluded spots, small cafes on the outskirts of the city where no one knew us, and deserted parks where we could hide from prying eyes. Every time we were together, I felt a mix of fear and excitement, knowing that this affair was not just infidelity. It was something far greater, keeping me on the edge, balancing between happiness and destruction. We both knew we were betraying Robert in the worst possible way. We understood this wasn't just a stab in the back, but a betrayal that would shatter his world if he found out. I tried to justify my actions, telling myself it was temporary, that I was just confused. But every time I looked into James's eyes, I knew. This wasn't just a fling. It had become an addiction. More and more, I was tormented by guilt. When I looked at Robert, saw his smile, felt his care, everything inside me churned. He was a good husband, and I knew he didn't deserve such betrayal. But every time I tried to break things off with James, I was pulled back to him like a magnet. I tried to convince myself it was just a phase, But reality was different. My double life became my new normal. By day, I was the devoted wife, cooking dinners and discussing future plans with Robert. But by evening, I lived another life, a life filled with secret meetings and forbidden conversations with his uncle. I knew I was walking a fine line, and each day that line was growing thinner. James was my secret refuge, but also the source of my torment. I knew I couldn't go on like this forever, but every time I tried to end it, something inside me wouldn't let me. I felt trapped by my own emotions and desires, with no escape. I saw myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman I had become, deceitful, broken, caught in my own lies. Each day, my bond with James grew deeper, and I couldn't tell where one life ended and the other began. Our secret meetings with James were becoming more dangerous, and I started noticing that Robert was paying more attention to me. His glances grew more intense. He often asked questions about my day, and it seemed he was listening to every word I said. I felt that something was changing, but I tried not to dwell on it. However, every time James was mentioned around Robert, I couldn't help but blush, and that didn't go unnoticed. One morning, when Robert seemed to have left for work, I felt slightly freer. I texted James that he could come over, and as usual, we spent time lost in our own world. But I didn't know that Robert hadn't gone far. He stayed nearby to keep an eye on me, and soon saw me heading towards James's place. Robert followed me and, hiding behind the bushes near James's house, peered through the window. What he saw left no room for doubt. James and I were standing too close, and everything was clear without words. Robert felt the ground shift beneath him. He could never have imagined that the infidelity he had begun to suspect would be so personal and destructive. He didn't want to believe that his wife had betrayed him with his own uncle. When Robert returned home, he seemed calm, but I noticed something new in his eyes: coldness and resolve. Later that evening, he asked me what was going on. I couldn't look him in the eyes, and my answers were evasive. He didn't push, but I knew this conversation was far from over. A few days later, Robert accidentally came across my chat with James, which I had forgotten to delete. The messages told the whole story: our confessions, plans to meet, and even memories of the night we spent together. Robert didn't confront me immediately. He was devastated by the betrayal, but knew he had to hear the truth from James as well. The next day, he went to his uncle. James greeted him calmly, as if nothing was wrong. But Robert wasn't there for pleasantries. His voice was filled with anger and pain as he demanded to know what was going on between him and his wife. James, not losing his confidence, admitted to their affair with cynical honesty, justifying it by saying that Olivia was unhappy in her marriage and had sought comfort. He spoke as if it was something natural and forgivable, and that broke Robert completely. For Robert, this was not just an affair. It was a betrayal by the two people closest to him. He felt his world crumbling, and it wasn't just deceit. It was an assault on everything he believed in regarding family and trust. When the truth came out, it felt like the world was collapsing around me. Robert didn't stay silent or endure quietly. He immediately demanded answers from me, but I couldn't respond to any of his questions. In his eyes, I saw a mix of pain and rage. Robert felt not just betrayed, but deeply humiliated. He couldn't believe that his own wife and uncle had deceived him in such a despicable way. It took only a few moments after our last argument for Robert to make his decision. He told me to pack my things and leave the house immediately. I tried to speak, to explain, but he didn't want to hear it. His words were cold and ruthless. "You betrayed not just me, but our entire family. You don't live here anymore." It was like a punch in the gut, and I couldn't recover. I knew I deserved his anger, but I still couldn't believe it was actually happening. As I left the house we had once dreamed of moving into, Robert didn't even look at me. He turned away, unwilling to see me go. At that moment, I realized I had lost everything: the house, my husband, and the bond that once held us together as a family. Robert was resolute, and I knew there would be no forgiveness. After I left, Robert cut all ties not only with me, but also with James. He blocked my cards, cut off my finances, and made it clear that he wanted nothing more to do with me. I was left alone, without support or means to survive. He even warned his family not to offer me any assistance, forbidding any communication. James was also cast out. Robert severed all contact with him, and even James's attempts to explain were met with silence. Robert knew that there was no justification for what had happened and wasn't interested in hearing apologies. In his eyes, we were both traitors unworthy of forgiveness. He made it clear that the affair with his uncle was not just a mistake, but a crime against everything he valued and held sacred. Every time I tried to reach out, Robert either ignored me or sent curt messages filled with contempt and anger. He wanted nothing to do with reconciliation and made it clear that, to him, we both ceased to exist. His words were filled with pain. "You're dead to me, and so is James." Those words cut deeper than any knife, and I knew there was no way back. After being thrown out of the house, I was left alone, surrounded only by the empty walls of a rented apartment I could barely afford. All I had was bitterness, pain, and the realization that I had destroyed my life with my own hands. My world, which had once seemed so stable, was now in ruins. I had lost my home, my husband, and most importantly, the trust of the people who once were my family. Living in solitude weighed heavily on me. Every morning, I woke up with a heaviness in my heart, knowing there was no way out of this situation. I tried to find work, but without Robert's financial support and with constant feelings of shame, everything seemed impossible. Every day, I reminded myself of what I had done, and the guilt ate away at me from the inside. I realized that no one wanted anything to do with me anymore, and it was a punishment I probably deserved. Just when it seemed things couldn't get worse, I began noticing changes in my health. At first, they were minor signs that I chalked up to stress, but soon I knew it was something more. I took a test, and it was positive. I was pregnant. That moment was a nightmare. I had no idea who the father was, Robert or James. This uncertainty was like a heavy stone dragging me down. Instead of joy, I felt only greater guilt and fear. I tried to reach out to James, hoping for some support, or at least a conversation. But his response was cold and ruthless. He made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with me or this situation. "This is your problem," he said when I tried to discuss my condition with him. James dismissed me as easily as he had once seduced me. He wasn't going to help or support me in any way. I was left alone, facing the consequences of my choices, with no one to turn to. I understood that my life would never be the same. I had destroyed everything that was dear to me and to those around me. Every day, I lived with the realization that I had made choices that changed everything. I was alone with this child, and I had to take responsibility for my actions. I couldn't escape my past, and the future seemed dark and hopeless. This was my fall, and I would need to find the strength to rise if I wanted to fix anything. I felt my life collapsing, and each new day brought more fear and shame. The pregnancy was not just a physical ordeal, but a moral nightmare. I was terrified to tell anyone about my condition. Inside, I was gripped by the fear that no one would understand or support me. I was alone, and every attempt to seek help ended in failure. No one wanted anything to do with a woman whose infidelity had torn a family apart. Every day, I felt more isolated. I avoided meeting neighbors, hid from old acquaintances, and even shied away from the few people who still tried to offer me friendship. I knew that the moment I revealed my pregnancy, all doors would slam shut for good. I was an outcast, a person who had destroyed her own life. When I tried to contact James one last time, it was more of a desperate cry for help, but he remained cold and unyielding. "You should have thought of that earlier," he said with such indifference that I realized I no longer existed to him. All his promises and warm words had turned out to be empty. James had no intention of supporting me emotionally or financially. He left me alone with my fears, and this was the final break I couldn't mend. My mistake with James became glaringly obvious. I realized that I had not only destroyed my marriage, but also my future. I had lost my family, my trust, and now my health. Stress and loneliness became my constant companions. I barely ate. My sleep was filled with restless awakenings, and every morning began with a sense of helplessness. My health was deteriorating daily, and one day, I collapsed on the street and ended up in the hospital. In the hospital, for the first time in a long time, I realized how severe my condition was. The doctors warned me that my health was at risk and that the baby might suffer too. I stared at the ceiling of the hospital room, realizing that everything I had strived for, everything that once seemed so important, had turned to dust. I was at rock bottom, and no one was going to lift me up. Each day in the hospital was a reminder of how I had wrecked my life. I was alone within four walls, and all that was left were my thoughts, which refused to let me rest. I realized that the only person who could change my situation was myself, but I had no strength left to fix anything. I was trapped by my own mistakes and guilt, with no way out. My pregnancy was a difficult ordeal, and I went through all the challenges alone, which proved to be far more exhausting than I had anticipated. When the baby was finally born, I knew I needed to uncover the truth that had been tormenting me for months. I decided to do a paternity test. It was necessary not just for me, but for my child. Deep down, I hoped Robert was the father. Perhaps if that were the case, I could at least partially ease my situation and give my child some semblance of a normal future. Several weeks passed before I received the results. I remember sitting in my tiny apartment, holding the envelope with the results, too scared to open it. Inside, a storm of emotions raged: fear, hope, guilt. I knew that this answer meant everything. When I finally mustered the courage to open it, tears filled my eyes. The results confirmed that Robert was the father of my child. It was a moment of relief, but also of new fear. How could I tell Robert, the man who had made it clear that I no longer existed to him? I debated for a long time whether to reach out to Robert. I knew he hated me, and I deserved that. But I couldn't help but hope that the news of him being the father might change something in his attitude towards me. With great anxiety, I sent him a message explaining the situation and attached the test results. It was a desperate gesture, hoping that he might want to talk, at least for the sake of our child. Robert didn't reply immediately. Days passed, and I almost lost hope. But one evening, he wrote back. His message was brief and cold. He acknowledged the test results and agreed to pay child support. However, he made it clear that he had no intention of speaking to me or participating in my life or our child's life. "I can't forgive either you or James," he wrote. His words were like a final sentence. I understood he was right. What I had done was unforgivable, and even though he agreed to support the child financially, his attitude towards me remained unwavering. Robert had burned all bridges and made it clear that he saw no future for us together. To him, I was forever a traitor, and no test could change that. This moment was a turning point for me. I realized I would have to fight for my daughter's future on my own. Robert wasn't coming back, and nothing I did could undo what had already happened. Now I had to be strong for the child who needed me more than ever. I was left alone with my child, and each day was a struggle. A struggle with myself, with guilt, and with the realization that my actions had ruined not only my future, but also the chances of a normal life for my daughter. My life without support felt like an endless marathon, where every step was taken with immense effort. Robert sent child support, but it did not fill the void left by his hatred and rejection of us. I tried to be a good mother, but my thoughts constantly returned to the past. Every day was a reminder of what I had done and the impossibility of turning back time. I looked at my daughter and understood that her arrival was the result of my mistakes, my wrong decisions. Each day, I became more aware that my affair with James had changed my life forever, and there was no going back. Almost every night, I would wake up in the middle of the night, tormented by memories. I replayed moments in my head when things could still have been fixed, when I could have said no and stayed true to myself and Robert. But those days were in the past, and now the only thing left was to learn to live with the consequences of my actions. I searched within myself, trying to understand when and why I lost control, but no answers came. There was only a sense of loss and pain that seemed insurmountable. Still, I knew I had to keep going, for my daughter, for myself. I started looking for work, tried to get our household in order, and become self-sufficient. I focused on raising my child, trying to surround her with the love that I no longer had anywhere else to direct. I attended courses, learned new skills, and tried to make plans for the future, though deep down, I knew I would never return to the life I had lost. I was no longer the Olivia who lived in a beautiful house with a loving husband. I had become someone else, a woman who realized her mistakes too late and now had to live with their consequences. My future was uncertain, but I knew I had to keep fighting, no matter what. My past was dark, but for my daughter's sake, I had to create some chance at a better life for us. I knew I couldn't change the past, but I still had to move forward. My past was filled with disappointments and mistakes, but I realized that my future depended solely on me. With the birth of my daughter, life took on new meaning, and I began searching for ways to change my fate. I decided to work on myself, striving for personal growth and rebuilding. I started learning new skills, enrolled in courses that would help me build a career and create a stable life for my daughter and me. My days became more structured. I started exercising, reading self-help books, and focused on raising my daughter. Each new day was a step forward, and gradually, I began to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I needed not just to survive, I needed to learn to live again. I wanted to become the best version of myself, not only for my sake, but for my daughter's, who deserved a better future. Gradually, my life began to fill with new acquaintances. I found support among people who didn't know my past, giving me a chance to start fresh. I met women at courses and local support groups for mothers who, like me, had gone through tough times. They didn't ask questions about what had happened in my life and accepted me as I was. Their support was the lifeline that kept me afloat during my darkest moments. One of the greatest sources of support during this time was my parents. Despite all the mistakes I had made, they never turned their backs on me. My parents helped me with raising my daughter, encouraged me, and gave me the time I needed to recover and find myself. They were my quiet anchor, always there, even when I struggled to believe in myself. Saying goodbye to the past became an inevitable step. I realized that I had to let go of Robert and James to move forward. Forgiveness wasn't about forgiving their actions, but forgiving myself for allowing it all to happen. I no longer wanted to cling to what had caused me pain. Robert and James were left in the past, and I no longer sought their forgiveness or approval. I understood that I had my own life, and I would no longer let others destroy it. Now, my main goal is to build a new future for myself and my daughter. I realized that no one but me could change my life. And though the road ahead would be tough, I finally felt that I had a chance to start over. Time passed, and I began to understand that I could no longer live trapped in my mistakes and guilt. Reconciling with myself became an important step. Accepting what had happened and forgiving myself was much harder than forgiving others. I realized that my life was the result of my choices and that I needed to learn to live with their consequences. But despite all the setbacks, I was gradually finding the strength to move forward. I began to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Instead of constantly dwelling on the past, I focused on the future and on what I could offer my daughter. I saw in her not just a reminder of my mistakes, but also a hope for something better. Every laugh, every new achievement of hers gave me strength and reminded me that we had a chance at happiness. Robert, despite his stubbornness and pain, began to show interest in being involved in our daughter's upbringing. It didn't happen overnight, but gradually, he started spending time with her, attending her celebrations, and taking an interest in her achievements. He didn't want to communicate with me, but his involvement in her life changed everything. I saw how she blossomed in his presence, how his attention made her feel loved and protected. It was something I couldn't provide on my own. All of this helped me finally forgive myself and accept that my life was my choices and my responsibility. I stopped looking back and started building my future, setting new goals and objectives. I planned to continue my education, find a job that brought me joy and stability, and create a life for my daughter and me that we could be proud of. Gradually, I felt myself finding inner harmony. I started setting new horizons for myself, no longer limiting myself with fears and doubts, but approaching life with confidence and calmness. My mistakes became my experience, and my failures, lessons. Now I knew that the future depended solely on me, and that I had all the strength I needed to change my destiny. Life goes on, and I am learning to accept it as it has become after all the trials. Every day, I remind myself that my mistakes are not a sentence, but an experience that should help me become better. I no longer live in the past, replaying old scenes or wondering what could have been different. Instead, I focus on rebuilding myself and becoming the best version of myself for the sake of myself and my daughter. Robert continues to support our daughter, and although he remains a part of her life, a chasm lies between us that cannot be bridged. All my attempts to establish some dialogue remain unsuccessful. He remains resolute and distant, and I know he sees no future for us together. Robert has found a new woman, and I can see that he is moving forward, leaving the past behind. It hurts to realize that I've lost someone I once loved, but I am learning to let that go too. As for James, he has completely disappeared from our lives as if he was never there. I no longer seek him, expect answers, or hope for his involvement. He remains a shadow of the past, a part of a story I want to leave behind. His absence is perhaps the best thing that could have happened after everything. I don't need a reminder of what I've done, and his disappearance has brought me a kind of relief. Now I am ready to start a new chapter of my life. I am learning not to fear looking forward, even if the road ahead is not always clear. I have my daughter, my family, and my new life, which I am slowly building from the fragments of the old one. I understand that my mistakes are not the end of the story, but part of it, leading me to a new beginning. Every day, I wake up with the determination to be stronger, wiser, and do everything possible to ensure my daughter grows up surrounded by love and stability. I plan for the future with hope and confidence, knowing that everything that has happened has only made me stronger. I no longer seek forgiveness, approval, or a return to the past. My story is a lesson, and I am ready to accept it with gratitude. Life continues, and I am ready to move forward, step by step, creating my new self. My path has not always been easy, but I finally see that I have a bright future ahead. And though it may be different from what I once envisioned, it will be my life, built on my lessons and my victories.